My name is Kenneth Oppel, and I am delighted to be presenting my latest novel, Bloom, tonight. This presentation is made possible through the generosity of the National Arts Centre of Canada and Facebook Live, with the additional support of the RBC Foundation, Slate Music, and Sirius XM Canada. During the presentation, I will actually be joined by a cast of dramatic readers who have, in fact, been quarantined with me, so it is completely safe. They had no choice in the matter as they are my family members, so no fears about physical distancing. I will also try at the end to answer any comments or questions that you have, so you can make them during my presentation. I'll save time at the end for any questions and comments. One of the things I get asked most frequently as a writer, as I'm sure most writers do, is where do your ideas come from? And in the case of Bloom, the idea came from two places. The first was a dream my eldest daughter, Sophia, had. She has very vivid dreams, very memorable dreams, and she was kind enough to share this one with me. And when she told me this dream, it was as if someone had thrown a stone into the puddle of my imagination, and all the ripples just radiated out from the epicenter. And as a writer, that's exactly what you want. You want some question or idea or inkling to send these ripples through your imagination and trigger more questions and thoughts and ideas. So this dream of my daughter's gave me the idea for a novel, or even three. So that was the first inspiration for Bloom, my daughter's dream. Now, the second idea for Bloom came from a sentence that I'd had a number of years ago, and I'd written it down in one of my ideas notebooks. In many ways, it wasn't a very interesting sentence, but I wrote it down to see if it would do anything in my ideas notebooks, and it didn't. It didn't germinate. Nothing happened to it until I heard that dream. And the sentence was this: there was a dead patch in the garden where nothing grew. Now, as I said, maybe you don't think it's a very interesting sentence, but it meant something to me. Maybe you all have dead patches in your gardens too. I certainly do. It's a place where no matter what you plant, nothing will grow. Now, I know there's a perfectly good explanation for this. It has to do with maybe too much light or too much shade or too much acidity in the soil. But my imagination tends to go a little darker, a little deeper. So, of course, the questions that sprung to my mind were, what's wrong with the soil? Is it cursed? Is there something diabolical bubbling up from the earth that makes it impossible for plants to grow? And then a second proposition occurred to me. I thought, well, what if one day something did begin to grow in this dead patch where nothing grew? And I thought that was a very interesting question. And that is exactly how my novel, Bloom, begins. It starts on Salt Spring Island in British Columbia, and it's springtime. And this is not a good time of year for my 15-year-old hero, Anaya. She has terrible seasonal allergies. She wakes up with her eyes glued shut. She sneezes convulsively. Her eyes water, her nose runs, her eyes are puffy. She has allergy-induced asthma. She has food sensitivities. She has acne as a result of skin sensitivities. As she herself says, I'm allergic to half the planet. And she's quite self-conscious about her appearance and the limitations that all her allergies impose on her life. Now, as my story opens, the island has just enjoyed an incredible downpour. And this is good news for Anaya because during a heavy rain, she gets a bit of a reprieve from her allergies. So she goes to school. But when she comes home, she takes a look at her garden and she sees, indeed, there is something unusual growing in that dead patch where nothing grows. It's a shoot, almost a foot tall, of very thick black grass, very spiky, and it absolutely was not there in the morning when she went to school. She has no idea where it came from, but this is what she sees. Now, her father is a botanist who works for the Ministry of Agriculture. He's never seen anything like this either. And this shoot of grass is not alone. Within a day, it has appeared all over the island, in people's yards and on people's farms. So Anaya and her father collect some samples from a local farm and are in the process of transporting these samples of this very strange black grass that no one has ever seen before, back to the experimental farm where Anaya's father works. Driving to the experimental farm with Dad, Anaya saw the black grass everywhere, growing from ditches alongside the road, stabbing up from lawns. Some people were already out with their mowers and weed whackers. Sheesh, said Dad. This stuff is speedy. Dad said a lot of things like
sheesh
and
wow
and
oh boy.
He was a pretty quiet guy, but when he talked about plants, he got very excited and talked like everyone in the world was just as enthusiastic. Sometimes he referred to plants as
guys
or
dudes
and used words like
sly
or
wondrous
when describing them. Anaya kept glancing at the rearview mirror. In the bed of the pickup, the black grass slid around, its roots waving in the breeze like they were alive.
This is what you'd call an invasive species, right?
Anaya asked. Oh yeah, said Dad. I have a feeling this scoundrel's going to cause a lot of trouble on the island. Anaya couldn't help smiling. Scoundrel. The parking lot of the experimental farm was deserted when they pulled in. When she was younger, Anaya thought an experimental farm should be a lot weirder and cooler than it turned out to be. She'd imagined giant cows and chickens the size of velociraptors and scraggly plots of grass. In reality, it was just a bunch of boring greenhouses and plants. Dad's specialty was grasses, which her friends thought was hilarious. Hey, Anaya, can your dad score us some grass? I hear he grows the best weed. Really, his specialty was figuring out ways to stop things growing, like invasive species that shouldn't have been there, but were, and were making life miserable for other plants. Dad grabbed the black grass sample from the back of the truck, and they walked out past the humble collection of buildings and greenhouses to the fields. Well, I certainly don't need to plant a trial plot, Dad said. Everywhere Anaya looked, the black grass was already bristling up. Inside the laboratory, they cleared space on a table for their specimens. So let's take a good look at our friend here, Dad said, adjusting a flex lamp.
What do you think it is?
Anaya asked. My guess is a series of Phragmites.
Sounds like some kind of superhero.
Just about. There's a strain that's gotten into Ontario. Wild grass. Stuff grows 10 feet high. Almost impossible to get rid of. So what do you notice about this guy? Anaya always liked that her father asked her for her opinions.
Really thick, lots of roots. Those spikes are wicked. And the black color. There's no other plant that color, is there?
There's stuff called black mondo grass, but it's more purpley. No, this stuff is truly black, which means it can photosynthesize any wavelength of light, which is pretty cool, right? This guy's adaptable.
So, if it's not black mondo or Phragmites, what is this?
No idea. It's probably always been around. We've just never noticed it. But I think I'll send this guy out for genetic testing. He got up and started to prepare a specimen bag. Someone else on Plant ID might have seen this by now. You mind opening up my laptop, Anaya? I'm still logged in.
Sure.
Dad had shown her this site plenty of times, and every time she was amazed at how many freaky plants there were out there. She flapped open the laptop and swallowed.
Dad?
He was labeling the bag. Mm-hmm.
You've got over 200 messages.
Before she could even start reading, 3 new messages scrolled onto the screen. Dad dropped the bag and sat down in his chair. He rolled the messages back to the beginning and clicked the first one. A picture of the black grass popped up. Seen it, the message said. Not black mondo grass. No idea what it is.
That's from Vancouver,
Anaya said, reading over Dad's shoulder. Click after click, more pictures of the black grass, more bewildered comments. Portland, Oregon, Dad murmured. Little Rock, Arkansas. Already 4 feet tall in the barley, the message said. Anyone else?
Click. New Orleans,
Said Anaya, reading the locations.
St. Lucia. Click.
Photos of black grass jutting up among banana plants.
Click.
Black grass rising from people's gutters in Finland.
Click.
Black grass reaching skyward along the Great Wall of China. You can chop it down. It grows back the very next day, more vigorous and taller than ever. You can spray it with pesticides. None of them, not even the most ardent, do the work and kill the black grass. Some farmers are so desperate that they take to burning the grass. The problem is the black grass, when you burn it, releases noxious fumes that sear and damage people's lungs, including some local farmers. After this happens at a local farm owned by a family called the Antos family, the town calls an emergency meeting. So the next scene takes place at the community hall in Salt Spring Island. Here's what we know, Anaya's father told the people crammed into the community center. Its spread is worldwide. We've seen it growing in tundra, in rainforest. There's even reports of it in the desert. So far, it's totally herbicide resistant. We've tried it all. It shares characteristics with a bunch of known plants, but right now the thinking is it's an entirely new species. And I was relieved that Dad managed to use it when talking about the black grass today. She wasn't sure anyone wanted to hear it referred to as dude or fascinating right now, especially after what had happened at the Antos farm. Every chair in the community center was filled, and people jostled along the sides and crunched together at the back. Even with all the windows open, the smell was pretty ripe. Salt Spring Island was earthy. There were lots of people who didn't believe in things like deodorant or soap or even socks. They believed in composting and damp wool. And meetings. Most of them seemed to love meetings. From the sidelines, Anaya watched her father. He was right up front with the island trustees and governing council, sitting behind a long table with flex microphones. Sergeant Sumner, Petra's mother, was up there too, representing the RCMP. Scanning the crowd, Anaya caught sight of Seth near the back in his usual hoodie, standing beside Mrs. Assos, who looked pale and weary.
Anaya, how are you?
Someone asked, and she felt a soft touch on her arm. It was Mr. Sumner and Petra.
Oh, hi,
Anaya said. Anaya always felt awkward and sad when she ran into Petra's parents. Mr. and Mrs. Sumner were always polite to her and sometimes a bit wistful, like they didn't understand why she and Petra weren't friends anymore, like they didn't know their own daughter was a disloyal backstabber who chucked her aside when she got ugly. She lifted her hand at Petra.
Hey,
Petra stretched her mouth into a grudging smile.
how's Mr. Antos?
Anaya asked. She figured Mr. Sumner would know since he worked at the hospital.
He's okay. He was really lucky. He inhaled a lot of smoke and it really damaged his lungs. Seth probably saved his life.
Anaya glanced back at Seth. Everyone had heard how he dragged Mr. Antos clear.
We have some stuff we wanted to show your father.
Mr. Sumner said to her.
Some plants Petra found. It might be useful.
I'll tell him.
Anaya said, and felt relieved when they moved on through the crowd. From the front of the hall, her father was saying, under no circumstances should you try to burn it.
How come no one told us it was toxic?
Anaya looked around, trying to find the person who'd shouted out the question. It was Tom Gutman, who had a farm near Wicked Point. Normally at meetings, people lined up at the mic and patiently waited their turn.
We should have known,
someone else shouted. Anaya shifted awkwardly. They were almost making it sound like Dad was to blame for what had happened. We didn't know yet, Anaya's father replied. Sergeant Sumner leaned into the mic.
We're imposing a fire ban, effective immediately. We can't have any more of that stuff set alight.
So where do we put it all?
Someone else asked.
I'm running out of space.
And it starts rooting again, someone else said, even after you cut it down. We need it off our land.
We're finding a site where you can haul it.
Sergeant Sumner said.
We have that location for you by the end of tomorrow.
Where are we supposed to do with our crops?
That was Tom Gutman again. I know this is very hard, Dad said, but for now, tilling is your only option. And he started outlining possible ways to save crops. Someone tapped her shoulder, and Anaya looked over to see Teresa in Fleetwood.
I thought you didn't believe in town meetings,
she whispered to her friend.
Fleetwood wanted to come.
Teresa said in her weary drawl.
He has theories.
Doesn't everyone?
Fleetwood said. Teresa looked at Anaya closely, smiled, and whispered into her ear.
Your face.
Anaya flushed with pleasure. The last couple of mornings, when she peeked warily at herself in the mirror, her acne looked a bit calmer. There were definitely fewer pimples, and they looked less angry. Also, the skin around her eyes wasn't nearly so puffy, so you could actually see her eyes. Anaya couldn't help smiling, even though it seemed completely frivolous to be thinking about her complexion right now.
We might lose our entire growing season.
A woman in the hall said loudly.
Is the government going to compensate us?
Or feed my goats!
Someone else called out.
There's no grazing for 'em. They can't eat that black grass. Too spiky.
While one of the trustees stuttered out a reply, Anaya noticed Ralph Jenkins step out into the aisle and make his way toward the mic. Ralph was one of the oldest residents of the island and generally considered a weirdo. He'd built his very own druidic standing stones and rented out his land as a spiritual retreat. He tapped the mic, sending a metallic shrill through the hall.
My name is Ralph Jenkins,
he said slowly and clearly.
Here we go,
murmured Anaya.
We know who you are, Ralph.
Someone called out to a few chuckles.
There is something you are not telling us,
Ralph Jenkins said, his amplified voice cutting through the clutter.
There is something you're not telling us, and we have a right to know.
I love this guy,
said Teresa, who looked interested for the first time.
Our government is not telling us where this weed comes from. Very good point,
said Fleetwood.
Because it sure seems to me,
said Ralph Jenkins,
that this weed could only be bioterrorism.
There were shouts of agreement and scattered applause.
We want the truth!
Someone called out.
This stuff didn't just come from nowhere.
Ralph Jenkins said,
I hear the news like everyone else. The U.S. blames China, and China blames them right back. And then everyone blames North Korea because they're so secretive. You've got the Middle East blaming people.
Nobody's blamed Canada yet.
Teresa said wryly.
We're too nice.
Please, Mr. Riggs,
said Ralph Jenkins,
tell us what you know. Is this something that escaped your farm? Or some other experimental facility?
Anaya looked back to her father. He'd been an islander most of his life, and everyone knew and mostly liked him. The guy at the Esso station had a weird hatred of him for some reason. But Dad was also an employee of the Ministry of Agriculture, which was the federal government, and so that of course meant Dad knew things and kept secrets, which was ridiculous. Ralph, I can honestly tell you, said Anaya's father, this plant did not escape from my farm or any facility in our country. And I know there's been a lot of finger pointing in the media, but every country on the planet has been equally hard hit.
That could be part of the plan,
Fleetwood whispered.
Oh, Fleetwood,
said Teresa.
No, seriously,
he said, turning his intense gaze from Teresa to Anaya.
Don't you think?
She smiled back awkwardly, feeling herself blush. Fleetwood hardly ever looked at her.
Well, it seems to me,
said Ralph Jenkins,
that unless we can get rid of this stuff, the planet's not going to be having a whole lot of food this year.
Anaya chewed on her upper lip. Ralph Jenkins wasn't sounding quite so crazy now. According to Dad and the news, all across the northern hemisphere, farmers were having trouble planting their crops. We're working on it, Ralph, Dad said. Not just Canada, but every country in the world. We'll get this stuff under control.
Seriously,
Fleetwood was whispering.
If you wanted to take over the world, you'd make it look like you were infested with black grass too. So no one suspected you, right? But you'd actually have the antidote. And when everyone else ran out of food and started to starve, you'd sell the antidote for like $1 trillion.
That's a pretty good plan.
Anaya admitted.
For a James Bond movie.
Teresa added. Then,
oh my gosh, he's still talking.
And I can't be the only person here,
Ralph Jenkins rambled on,
who noticed that all this stuff started growing right after the big rain.
Sorry, Mr. Jenkins, said Dad. You're saying the rain...
Very next day it comes up. Is that a coincidence? I think not. I did predict this, of course, in my podcast last year.
People started telling Ralph to sit down. Eventually, Ralph threw up his hands in disgust and stalked off.
I think Mr. Jenkins might be right,
Said a voice near the front, and with astonishment, Anaya realized it was Petra. There she was, walking up to the mic with perfect poise. That takes guts, Anaya thought grudgingly. Then again, Petra had always loved being the center of attention. When they were little, they were both bossy, but Petra usually managed to end up with the best crayons, the best action figure, and the best part in the basement plays they put on. She loved being front of people. But what on earth was she doing right now?
I think the seeds were inside the rain,
Petra said. The crowd was suddenly very quiet.
Whoa.
Teresa mouthed to Anaya.
Hot gossip.
What makes you say that, Petra? Anaya heard Dad ask.
I collected some of it, the rain, because, well, for some reason, I'm not allergic to it.
Anaya rolled her eyes as a murmur of sympathy burbled up from the audience. Did the entire island know about Petra's tragic water allergy?
Anyway, this morning there were little plants growing inside the bottles. They were all different, but I'm pretty sure one was the black grass.
Anaya saw Dad nodding patiently. I'd like to have a look at those plants if you still have them, he said. But I think it's more likely the seeds got blown into the water or fell from overhanging
It
vegetation.
came from the rain!
How do you explain the rest of the world then?
Someone shouted.
It rained all over the world.
Fleetwood beam boomed out, and Anaya looked at him in surprise. Teresa actually held her hand over her face in embarrassment.
It was on the news. Remember?
Fleetwood said, stammering a bit now.
They had like satellite pictures and it was all cloudy. It rained pretty much everywhere on the planet over a 3-day period, so...
He trailed off, but he was right. Anaya remembered watching the news with her parents and the weather guy mentioning it, how unusual it was. She watched her father's face. She could tell he was thinking hard. It looked like he was about to speak, but one of the counselors bent over her mic and said,
I think we can discuss these very interesting theories after the meeting, but we have some other important business to address. We need volunteer crews to keep the grass under control.
I can't believe you.
Teresa whispered to Fleetwood, her face still flushed.
You actually think someone made it rain all over the world?
Hey, I'm not the only one on the internet.
Fleetwood, we've talked about this. Everything is on the
We
internet.
can control the weather now.
Oh boy.
Teresa looked at Anaya, shaking her head. Anaya smiled back weakly, but she couldn't dismiss it. Dad didn't. She could tell by the serious look
I
on his
just
face.
said maybe it's possible, theoretically, to make it rain all over the planet at once.
Okay.
Said Teresa.
So how did they deliver all the seeds? 1,000,000 airplanes?
Fleetwood looked deflated.
Yeah, I guess we would have seen the planes on our radar or something.
Cloaking technology.
Said Teresa, slipping her hand into Fleetwood's. Fleetwood grinned and winked at Anaya.
Yeah, maybe.
Anaya laughed, feeling some of the anxiety leave her shoulders. It did sound pretty far-fetched. Teresa kissed Fleetwood on the cheek.
Maybe it's not even a country doing this. Maybe it's a secret organization called Slork or something.
And an evil dude with scary glasses,
Said Anaya.
biding his time in his underground lair with his supermodels and personal chef.
And Pet Komodo Dragon.
Fleetwood added, and then sneezed. Teresa sneezed too, and laughed. But then she sneezed again, and kept sneezing. Anaya was suddenly aware of all the other people sneezing from every part of the hall. It sounded like some kind of malfunctioning engine. People held their elbows and tissues to their mouths. There's something scary about it, like everyone had suddenly lost control of their bodies. She looked at her father up front and saw him sneezing too. Inside, the light had changed somehow. Anaya tilted her face up to the open window. The air glittered with dust, or something. She was pushed along with the tide of people heading for the doors. Outside, all around the sides of the parking lot grew black grass. The very tallest stalks looked different, and it only took Anaya a second to understand why. Just yesterday, the flowers on the tall central stems were still tight black buds. Now they were wide open. To Anaya, they looked a bit like black sunflowers. The centers bristled with pale pollen. A horn honked at her. She stepped out of the way as a car trying to leave the parking lot zoomed by her, the windows rolled up, the driver jerking with sneezes. Anaya walked closer to the black grass, staring up at the flowers. The breeze rustled the stalks together. Maybe it was the unpleasant scraping sound or the big face-like flowers, but Anaya had never felt so keenly that the grass had an intelligence. With a faint creak, one of the flowers tilted its head skyward and then snapped forward. With a loud pop that made Anaya jolt, 1,000 tiny grains of pollen exploded through the air. A second pop made her turn as more flowers released their mist of pollen. Everywhere the flowers arched and recoiled as their pollen shot through the air. The parking lot was chaos now, people shouting and sneezing and hurrying toward their cars. Doors slammed, cars started, horns blared overhead. The air was heavy with pollen, the sunlight illuminating the golden grains as they danced and swirled higher in the heat of the afternoon. And Anaya thought, that is one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen. Across the parking lot, she caught sight of Seth and Petra. They weren't sneezing at all, and neither was she. Luckily for my three heroes, Anaya, Petra, and Seth, they are completely immune to the pollen that the black grass produces, as they are immune to the new plants that suddenly start appearing on the planet and taking it over. I hope, if you're intrigued, you will acquaint yourselves with these other plants and my characters in the novel Bloom. And as I mentioned earlier, this is a story that began really from a dream that I kindly stole from my daughter. And I'm wondering, now that I've got you here, how do you feel about telling the story, your dream?
Sure.
I would love to hear it.
Yeah. Several years ago, I in the dream I was walking along a highway, sort of desolate industrial kind of landscape. I think some sort of like electrical fields and pylons on either side, maybe some overpasses. And it starts raining really suddenly and really heavily, really huge, thick raindrops falling everywhere. And suddenly the rain stops just as suddenly as it had started.
Mm-hmm.
And everywhere the ground is sort of thick with these big kind of bulbous objects, and I realized that they weren't actually raindrops.
It's not rain.
It's not rain. They were sort of like bug eggs or chrysalists. And then just moments after all of these drops settle, there's this kind of twitching, cracking, bristling sound, and all of the eggs or chrysalids start hatching. And then in one sort of fluid motion, all of these bugs, winged bugs, kind of alight into the air and fill the air really suddenly, and they're kind of like large locusts. And so I start running away from this sort of cloud of bugs, and I run to sort of like an overpass or an underpass, like a bridge, and I'm going to try and take shelter in the bridge. And there's an enormous one of these bugs or locusts that's eating a man who I guess was under the bridge. That's when the dream ends.
That's it.
That's it.
I think that is a pretty good dream. And when I heard that, as I mentioned, I thought, I can work with this. This is good stuff. So I'm very glad you shared it with me. Thank you. And if you read Bloom and you finish it, you will see how I put that nightmare to use at the end of Bloom, and also at the beginning of the second book in the trilogy, Hatch. I needed to do very little. Very little has changed from the dream you just heard from my daughter. Thank you, Sophie.
No problem.
Thank you all so much for joining me. I really liked sharing Bloom with you. If you've been making comments and asking me questions along the way, I'm going to answer them. I guess I can answer them right now. I see them filling up my screen. I'll answer a few. Before I do, just let me say thanks again to the National Arts Centre of Canada, Facebook Canada, Sirius XM Canada, the Slate Music and RBC Foundation. It's been a treat joining you. And now let me just move very closer in front of my artfully placed plant, and I can maybe answer some of these questions for you guys. Lots of love, Bloom, need Hatch now. I like that. Nice to hear my voice after reading your books. Thank you. When I write my books, I have a very clear image of how the characters sound. Not always such a great image of how they look, but I definitely hear them in my head. So I'm glad that you could hear them too. What else am I seeing here? Thank you. You're very welcome. If any of you had any questions you wanted to, just post them underneath this stream on Facebook, and I promise I will reply to them. Thank you very much. Stay safe.